Drink that killed. Amy Winehouse was 27 years old when she was found dead in her bed at her home at 30 Camden Square in North London on July 23, 2011. She was alone in her bedroom, and she had been drinking. Winehouse had spent the better part of a decade becoming one of the most recognized voices in British music. Her two studio albums, Frank and Back to Black, had established her as a performer with a range and emotional directness that drew comparisons to the great soul singers of the 1960s. Back to Black, released in 2006, won 5 Grammy Awards in 2008, a record for a British artist at that time. She was known for her contralto voice, her beehive hairstyle, and the unflinching honesty of her lyrics. She was also known, increasingly and publicly, for her struggles with alcohol. In the years following the release of Back to Black, Winehouse's public appearances became unpredictable. Concerts were canceled. Performances were cut short. She appeared on stage at various points in states that concerned audiences and venue staff alike. By 2011, she had not released a studio album in 5 years. The pressure around her recovery was significant and widely reported. In the weeks before her death, Winehouse had been making an attempt to stop drinking. She had been working with medical professionals on that effort. Her team was aware of her condition. Those close to her had noted both progress and setbacks in the period leading up to July 23rd. She had been living at the Camden Square address, a 4-story townhouse, for some time. It was a private residence, not a hotel or a rehabilitation facility. She was there with members of her personal staff, including a bodyguard who was on the premises. On the evening of July 22nd and into the early hours of July 23rd, Winehouse had been drinking vodka. 3 empty vodka bottles were later found in her bedroom. There was no indication during the night that a medical emergency was unfolding. No alarm was raised. No one reported hearing anything that suggested distress. On the afternoon of July 23rd, at approximately 3:45 p.m., her bodyguard went to check on her. He found her unresponsive in her bed. She was lying in a position that gave no immediate indication of what had happened. He attempted to rouse her. She did not respond. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived at 30 Camden Square and attended to Winehouse in the bedroom. She was assessed at the scene. The attempts made there could not reverse what had already occurred. Winehouse was pronounced dead at the scene. She was not transported to a hospital. There was no period of treatment that preceded her death. She was gone before help arrived. The Metropolitan Police were called and the scene was secured. An investigation was opened as a matter of procedure. A post-mortem examination was conducted. The initial results were inconclusive pending toxicology. A coroner's inquest was opened. The first inquest was adjourned when it emerged that the coroner presiding over the case did not hold the correct qualifications under a recently changed law. A second inquest was convened. It was heard in January of 2013. The evidence presented included the toxicology report from her post-mortem examination. That report confirmed that Winehouse's blood alcohol level at the time of her death was 4.16 milligrams per milliliter. The legal drink drive limit in the United Kingdom at the time was 0.8 milligrams per milliliter. Her blood alcohol level was more than 5 times that threshold. The coroner at the second inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. The cause of death was recorded as accidental alcohol poisoning. The evidence established that the amount of alcohol in her system at the time of her death was sufficient on its own to be fatal. The 3 empty vodka bottles found in her room were consistent with the toxicology results. Amy Winehouse was pronounced dead at 30 Camden Square, London, on July 23, 2011. She was 27 years old. The cause of death was accidental alcohol poisoning. Shot outside store. Jossa Dwayne Ricardo Onfroy, known professionally as XSX Temptation, was 20 years old when he was shot and killed in the parking lot of a motorsports dealership in Deerfield Beach, Florida, on June 18, 2018. He had walked out of the store minutes before he died. Onfroy had emerged as one of the more polarizing figures in American music during the mid-2010s. He recorded and released music across multiple genres, blending elements of hip-hop, alternative rock, and emo in ways that attracted a large and devoted audience, particularly among younger listeners. His 2018 single Sad and his debut studio album 17 both performed strongly on the Billboard charts. By mid-2018, he was one of the most streamed artists in the country. He was also facing serious criminal charges at the time of his death, including charges of assault, which were unresolved. On the afternoon of June 18, 2018, Onfroy was at Rava Motorsports, a dealership located on South Federal Highway in Deerfield Beach. He had gone there in connection with a motorcycle purchase. He was accompanied by associates. The transaction involved a significant amount of cash. Onfroy left the dealership carrying a Louis Vuitton bag containing $50,000 in cash. Surveillance cameras were operating in and around the dealership at the time. The footage captured what followed in detail. As Onfroy sat in his black BMW attempting to drive out of the parking lot, a dark SUV blocked his path and two armed men approached his vehicle. The men wore masks. The approach was rapid. What followed was captured on the surveillance footage and would later be entered into evidence during criminal proceedings. Onfroy was shot. He was shot multiple times in the neck area, as confirmed by the medical examiner. The $50,000 in the Louis Vuitton bag was taken by the assailants, who fled the scene in a dark-colored SUV. Witnesses in and around the parking lot were present at the time of the shooting. The confrontation was brief. The two men approached, shots were fired, and they were gone. Onfroy was left in or near his vehicle. Emergency services were called. Paramedics responded to the scene on South Federal Highway. They found Onfroy with multiple gunshot wounds. He was transported from the scene to Broward Health North Hospital in Deerfield Beach. The transport was urgent. Medical personnel at the hospital received him and made attempts to treat the wounds and stabilize him. Those efforts were unsuccessful. XSX Temptation was pronounced dead at Broward Health North Hospital on June 18, 2018. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as multiple gunshot wounds. The investigation moved quickly. Surveillance footage provided investigators with imagery of the vehicle used by the assailants and of the assailants themselves. 4 men were ultimately charged in connection with the killing. They were identified as Dedrick Williams, Robert Allen, Michael Boatwright, and Trayvon Newsom. The prosecution presented the case as a targeted robbery. The $50,000 Onfroy had been carrying was identified as the motive. Michael Boatwright, Trayvon Newsom, and Dedrick Williams were convicted of first-degree murder. The case established through court proceedings that the attack was planned and deliberate. Plane crash, Iowa. On February 3, 1959, a Beechcraft Bonanza aircraft carrying 3 of the most prominent young musicians in American rock and roll departed Mason City Municipal Airport in Iowa shortly before 1 a.m. and never reached its destination. All 3 passengers and the pilot were dead before sunrise. Buddy Holly was 22 years old. He had co-written and recorded some of the most recognized songs in early rock and roll, including That'll Be the Day and Peggy Sue. He was traveling with his band, The Crickets, and a revolving group of other performers as part of a touring package called the Winter Dance Party. Richie Valens was 17 years old. He had released La Bamba and Donna, both of which had charted nationally. He had been recording professionally for less than a year. J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, was 28 years old. His song Chantilly Lace had been a significant commercial success in 1958. He was traveling as one of the featured performers on the Winter Dance Party tour. The Winter Dance Party had been booked across the upper Midwest during one of the coldest stretches of the winter season. The touring conditions were severe. The buses used to transport the performers between venues were experiencing repeated mechanical failures, particularly with the heating systems. Performers had been riding in freezing temperatures between shows for days. Several members of the touring party had developed illness during the run. The show on February 2nd had taken place at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa. After the performance, Holly arranged to charter a small plane to fly from Mason City to Moorhead, Minnesota, where the tour's next show was scheduled. His intention was to arrive early enough to have time to laundry done and to rest before the next performance. 2 seats on the plane went to Valens and Richardson under circumstances that were reported differently by various accounts. The pilot was Roger Peterson, a 21-year-old employed by Dwyer Flying Service. The aircraft was a Beechcraft Bonanza, registration N3794EN. It was a single-engine, 4-seat plane. The weather conditions at the time of departure were poor. Ceiling and visibility were limited. Temperatures were well below freezing. The plane departed Mason City Municipal Airport at approximately 12:55 a.m. on February 3rd. It climbed out from the airport and turned northwest. Radar contact was not maintained after departure. Witnesses near the airport reported seeing the aircraft's lights descend toward the ground shortly after takeoff. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated the crash. Its findings identified pilot error as the probable cause. Peterson was not certified to fly by instruments alone, and the conditions that night required instrument navigation. The board concluded that Peterson likely experienced spatial disorientation, a condition in which a pilot loses accurate perception of the aircraft's attitude relative to the ground, and entered a descent without recognizing it. The wreckage was not discovered that night. The following morning, flying service owner Hubert Dwyer took off to search for the missing plane along its intended route and spotted the wreckage in a frozen cornfield owned by Albert Ewell. The plane had impacted the ground at high speed. The 4 occupants, Hawley, Valens, Richardson, and Peterson, were found at the scene. All 4 had been killed on impact. Law enforcement and investigators arrived at the field. The site was documented and processed. The Civil Aeronautics Board conducted its full investigation in the weeks that followed, producing the findings that identified Peterson's spatial disorientation as the cause of the descent. Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson were killed on impact when Beechcraft Bonanza N3794N struck a frozen cornfield near Clear Lake, Iowa, in the early morning hours of February 3, 1959. Pilot Roger Peterson also died. The Civil Aeronautics Board cited pilot error in instrument conditions as the cause. Graceland bathroom. Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the floor of his bathroom at Graceland, his estate in Memphis, Tennessee, on August 16, 1977. He was 42 years old. He was scheduled to fly to Portland, Maine that evening for the first show of a new tour. Presley had been the dominant figure in American popular music for more than 2 decades. His recordings beginning in the mid-1950s had changed the sound and commercial structure of American music. He had starred in films, sold out arenas, and commanded television audiences in the tens of millions. By the mid-1970s, he was performing a heavy schedule of live shows, primarily in Las Vegas and on the road. He was one of the most recognizable people on Earth. By 1977, Presley's physical condition had become a matter of significant concern to those around him. His weight had increased substantially from his earlier years. He was dealing with multiple documented health issues. He was dependent on a range of prescription medications, a dependency that had developed over years and had been documented by members of his personal circle, his physicians, and later by investigative journalists and biographers working from verified records. The medications confirmed to have been present in his system at the time of his death included codeine, ethinamate, methaqualone, diazepam, and other prescription sedatives. These were not street substances, they were prescription drugs, obtained through medical channels, and they had accumulated in his system in quantities that would later be identified as a significant factor in what happened. On the morning of August 16, 1977, Presley had been awake during the night. This was not unusual. His sleep schedule had long been irregular. He spent time that night and into the early morning with his girlfriend Ginger Alden, who was staying at Graceland. At some point in the morning, Presley went to his bathroom. Alden fell asleep. In the early afternoon, Alden woke and could not find Presley in the bedroom. She went to the bathroom door and called for him. There was no response. She opened the door and found him on the floor, face down, in front of the toilet. She called for help immediately. Members of Presley's staff reached the bathroom within moments. Emergency services were contacted. Paramedics were dispatched to Graceland. When they arrived and entered the bathroom, they found Presley on the floor. He was unresponsive. His condition when found was serious. Attempts to resuscitate him were begun at the scene. He was loaded into an ambulance and transported to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. The drive from Graceland to the hospital took only minutes. Medical personnel at Baptist Memorial received him and continued resuscitation efforts. A full team was engaged in attempting to stabilize him. Those efforts continued for a period of time before the medical team determined that they could not be successful. Elvis Presley was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital at 3:30 p.m. on August 16, 1977. The medical examiner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, initially cited cardiac arrhythmia as the cause of death. Subsequent reviews of the case, including a significant re-examination in 1994, identified polypharmacy, the presence of multiple prescription medications in his system at toxic levels, as a significant contributing factor to the cardiac event that killed him. The toxicology confirmed the presence of codeine, ethinamate, methaqualone, diazepam, and additional sedative compounds. He was 42 years old, gunshot in Dakota, John Lennon was 40 years old when he was shot 4 times in the back outside his apartment building in New York City on the night of December 8, 1980. He had been returning home from a recording session. Lennon had been one of the founding members of the Beatles, the British group whose influence on popular music beginning in the early 1960s remained unmatched by the time of his death. After the Beatles dissolved in 1970, Lennon had pursued a solo career, releasing albums that addressed personal, political, and philosophical themes. He had spent several years living in New York City, where he resided with his wife, Yoko Ono, and their son, Sean, at the Dakota, a historic residential building on the Upper West Side at 72nd Street and Central Park West. By late 1980, Lennon had ended a period of semi-retirement and was actively recording again. He and Ono had released Double Fantasy in November of 1980, his first studio album in 5 years. The record had been well received, and Lennon had been conducting interviews and working in the studio at the record plant in Midtown Manhattan. On December 8, 1980, Lennon and Ono left the Dakota during the day to travel to the record plant for a recording session. As they departed the building that afternoon, Lennon paused at the request of a fan who was waiting outside. That fan was Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old from Hawaii who had traveled to New York and had been positioned outside the Dakota on multiple occasions in the preceding days. Chapman produced a copy of Double Fantasy, and Lennon signed it. The encounter was photographed. Chapman remained outside the building after Lennon and Ono departed. Lennon and Ono returned to the Dakota at approximately 10:50 p.m. They had been dropped off near the building's entrance on 72nd Street. The doorman, Jose Perdomo, was at his post. As Lennon walked toward the entrance to the building, Chapman stepped forward from near the archway and called out to him. Chapman then fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber revolver. 4 of those shots struck Lennon in the back and left shoulder area. 1 shot did not connect. Lennon was hit 4 times. He staggered forward through the entrance of the building. He made it as far as the security office just inside the archway, where he collapsed. Perdomo contacted the police immediately. 2 police officers, Bill Gamble and James Moran, arrived at the scene within minutes of the shooting. They found Lennon on the floor of the security office, conscious and bleeding severely from the gunshot wounds. The officers did not wait for an ambulance. They lifted Lennon and carried him to their patrol car and drove him to Roosevelt Hospital, which was located approximately 10 blocks away. Lennon arrived at Roosevelt Hospital at approximately 11 p.m. The medical team at the emergency room received him immediately. The wounds he had sustained were to the upper left side of his body. He had lost a significant amount of blood. The trauma team worked to address the injuries and to restore circulation. The extent of the damage to the major blood vessels in the area of the wounds made the effort extremely difficult to sustain. Despite the speed of the response and the immediacy of the medical attention, the team was unable to reverse what the wounds had done. John Lennon was pronounced dead on arrival at Roosevelt Hospital at 11:07 p.m. on December 8, 1980. The cause of death was gunshot wounds. Mark David Chapman did not flee the scene. He remained standing in the archway of the Dakota after the shooting, reading a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, the novel he had been carrying. He was arrested by responding officers without incident. He was charged with second-degree murder, to which he pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He has been denied parole at every hearing held since he became eligible. Plaindown, Tennessee. Patsy Cline was 30 years old when the Piper Comanche 250 she was traveling in crashed into a wooded hillside near Camden, Tennessee on March 5, 1963. She was on her way home from a charity concert. Cline had been one of the most commercially successful country music artists of her era. Her recordings, including Walkin' After Midnight, I Fall to Pieces, Crazy, and She's Got You, had crossed over from country charts to mainstream pop audiences in a way that few country artists had managed. She was a member of the Grand Ole Opry and one of the most requested performers of her time. Her voice was considered remarkable for its range and control. In early March of 1963, Cline traveled to Kansas City, Kansas, to perform at a benefit concert held in memory of disc jockey Jack Call, known on air as Cactus Jack, who had died in a car accident. The concert was held on March 3rd. Also performing were 2 other country music artists, Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins. The 3 performers were managed in part by a man named Randy Hughes, who was also Cline's manager and who was a private pilot. After the concert, the performers spent time in Kansas City before preparing to return to Nashville. Hughes was piloting the Piper Comanche 250. The aircraft departed Dyersburg, Tennessee, where the group had stopped for fuel on the afternoon of March 5th. The weather conditions in the region had been variable. A significant weather system was moving through the area. The plane was on approach toward Nashville when the weather deteriorated. The aircraft encountered conditions that reduced visibility and made navigation difficult. Hughes was piloting. The plane never reached Nashville. The wreckage was found in a heavily wooded area near Camden, Tennessee, approximately 90 miles west of Nashville. The impact site was in the trees on a hillside. The plane had gone down in an area that was not immediately accessible. The crash had been severe. All 4 occupants, Klein, Copus, Hawkins, and Hughes, were killed. The search for the aircraft had begun the previous evening when the plane failed to arrive and contact was lost. Ground teams and other searchers worked through the night and into the following day. The wreckage was located on March 6th. Recovery of the 4 bodies from the crash site was undertaken by emergency personnel and local authorities, who had to navigate difficult terrain to reach the location. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated the crash. Its findings identified the pilot's decision to continue flying into adverse weather conditions as the probable cause. Hughes had not been certified for instrument flight, and the conditions he encountered required it. The investigation concluded that the decision to press on through deteriorating weather was the determining factor in the loss of the aircraft. Patsy Cline was killed on impact when the Piper Comanche 250 struck the hillside near Camden, Tennessee, on March 5, 1963. The cause of death was blunt force trauma consistent with the crash impact. Overdose in Mayfair. Keith Moon was 32 years old when he was found dead in a Mayfair flat in London on September 7, 1978. He had taken 32 tablets of a prescription sedative. The number of tablets matched his age. Moon had been the drummer for The Who since the band's formation in the early 1960s. He was widely considered one of the most technically distinctive and physically forceful drummers in rock music. His style was characterized by a relentless and unpredictable approach to the kit, and his performances with The Who across more than a decade had made him one of the most recognized figures in British music. The band had released Tommy Who's Next and Quadrophenia, albums that had defined a generation of rock music. Moon was central to all of it. By the late 1970s, Moon's health was a concern to those around him. His alcohol use had been significant for years and had accelerated. He had relocated to Los Angeles for a period before returning to England. The physical effects of long-term heavy drinking had become apparent. His physician had prescribed clomethazole, sold under the brand name Heminevrin, to help manage alcohol withdrawal. The drug was a sedative hypnotic used in clinical settings to reduce the dangers of abrupt alcohol cessation. It required careful dosing and monitoring. The prescribed dose was 1 tablet at a time, as needed, not to exceed a specified daily limit. On the evening of September 6, 1978, Moon attended the London premiere of the film The Buddy Holly Story. He was accompanied by his girlfriend, Annette Walter Lax. After the premiere, they attended a dinner at Peppermint Park Restaurant, which was also attended by Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney, among others. Accounts of that evening describe Moon as being in reasonable spirits. The group spent time together before Moon and Walter Lax returned to the flat they were using at 9 Curzon Place in Mayfair. The flat at 9 Curzon Place had a particular history. It was the same apartment in which singer Cass Elliot had died 4 years earlier in 1974. Moon had taken up residence there while in London. After returning to the flat in the early hours of September 7th, Moon and Walter Lax settled in for the night. At some point in the early morning, Moon woke up and went to the kitchen where he prepared and ate a meal. He then returned to the bedroom. Walter Lax was present throughout the morning. At some point she fell asleep. When she woke and checked on Moon, she found him unresponsive in the bed. Walter Lax called for emergency services. Paramedics arrived at 9 Curzon Place and attended to Moon. He was assessed at the scene. He was not responsive. The attempts made by paramedics at the flat were not successful in reviving him. Moon was pronounced dead at the flat. He was not transported to a hospital. The medical examiner subsequently confirmed the cause of death. The toxicology findings established that 32 tablets of clomethazole had been found in his system. The prescribed medication taken in that quantity had resulted in a fatal level of sedation. Keith Moon was pronounced dead at 9 Curzon Place, Mayfair, London, on September 7, 1978. He was 32 years old. The cause of death was an accidental overdose involving clomethazole, taken at a quantity that far exceeded the prescribed dosage. Cadillac in West Virginia. Hank Williams was found dead in the back seat of his Cadillac on January 1st, 1953, during a journey between Knoxville, Tennessee, and Canton, Ohio. He was 29 years old. He had a show scheduled that night in Canton. Williams had been one of the defining figures in country music since the late 1940s. His recordings for MGM Records, including Your Cheatin' Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, and Hey Good Lookin', had reached audiences across country radio and had established him as the dominant voice in the genre. He had been a member of the Grand Ole Opry, though his relationship with the organization had deteriorated due to missed and canceled appearances. He was known for live performances that drew devoted crowds, and for a personal life that had become increasingly chaotic in his final years. By late 1952, Williams was in serious physical decline. He had long dealt with a spinal condition that caused him significant pain. His alcohol use had intensified. He had also been using prescription medications to manage pain and to function through a performance schedule that continued even as his health worsened. His behavior had become unpredictable. The Grand Ole Opry had dismissed him from its roster in August of 1952. Despite these circumstances, Williams had concert bookings extending into the new year. On New Year's Day, 1953, he was scheduled to perform in Canton, Ohio. He had been booked the night before for a show in Charleston, West Virginia, which was also canceled due to weather. A severe winter storm had affected the region, grounding flights and making road travel difficult. Because flights out of Knoxville were not operating, Williams hired a college student named Charles Carr to drive him by car to Canton. Before the journey began, a physician in Knoxville administered 2 injections to Williams. The injections were described as containing B12 vitamins and morphine. Williams was assisted into the back seat of his Cadillac. Carr drove. The journey north from Knoxville was long. The winter weather made the roads difficult. The vehicle moved through the night and into the early morning hours of January 1st. At some point, Carr stopped the car. Accounts indicate this was in the area of Oak Hill, West Virginia, to check on Williams. When Carr reached the back seat, he found Williams unresponsive. Carr sought help. He contacted a local physician and then authorities. A doctor arrived and examined Williams in the car. He found no pulse and no signs of life. Williams had been dead for some time before he was found. The precise moment at which he died during the journey was not established. Williams was transported and an autopsy was conducted. The findings of the autopsy identified acute right ventricular dilation and hemorrhages in the heart as the immediate cause of death. Alcohol and morphine were confirmed to be present in his system. The combination of his underlying cardiac condition, the presence of alcohol, and the morphine administered before the journey were identified as contributing factors. Hank Williams was pronounced dead on January 1st, 1953. He was 29 years old. The cause of death was recorded as acute right ventricular dilation and heart failure, with alcohol and morphine identified as contributing factors. Plaindown, Wisconsin. Otis Redding was 26 years old when the Beechcraft H-18 twin-engine plane carrying him and members of his band descended into Lake Monona near Madison, Wisconsin, on December 10, 1967. The plane was 3 miles short of Truax Field when it went into the water. Redding had spent the mid-1960s establishing himself as one of the most powerful performers in soul and rhythm and blues music. He had recorded for Volt Records, a subsidiary of Stax, and had released a series of recordings that built his reputation steadily. His performances at major music festivals in 1967, including the Monterey Pop Festival, had expanded his audience beyond his established fan base and introduced him to the rock audiences that dominated the music landscape of that period. By late 1967, he was at the height of his commercial and critical standing. On December 9, 1967, Redding and his backing group, the Bar-Kays, had performed a show in Cleveland, Ohio. They then boarded a plane to travel to Madison, Wisconsin, where another performance was scheduled for December 10th. The aircraft they were traveling in was a Beechcraft H-18, a twin-engine propeller-driven plane. The group departed and made the journey toward Madison. The weather in the Madison area on December 10th was poor. Fog and low visibility conditions were present over the region. The plane was on its approach to Truax Field when it encountered difficulties. Witnesses near the lake reported hearing the plane before it went down. The aircraft descended into Lake Monona approximately 3 miles from the runway at Truax Field. The descent was rapid and the impact with the water was severe. Emergency services and rescue personnel were dispatched to the lake as soon as reports came in. The lake was cold. The conditions for a search and rescue operation were difficult. Rescuers worked to locate and reach the crash site in the water. Of the 8 people aboard the plane, only 1 survived. Ben Cawley, the trumpet player for the Barkays, was pulled from the water alive. All other passengers, including Redding and 4 other members of the Barkays, were killed in the crash or lost in the lake. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated the incident. The investigation concluded that the probable cause of the crash was undetermined, though poor weather and limited visibility were cited as major factors. The specific sequence of events in the cockpit was not fully reconstructible from the available evidence. Redding's body was recovered from Lake Monona in the days following the crash. The recovery operation continued as conditions allowed. Otis Redding was killed when the Beechcraft H-18 he was traveling in crashed into Lake Monona near Madison, Wisconsin on December 10, 1967. He was 26 years old. The cause of death was blunt force trauma and drowning consistent with the crash impact. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.